Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. By every objective measure, unless you live in the south side of Chicago, the world is a safer place today than it's been for a long time. As people like Steven Pinker have repeatedly pointed out, almost every form of violence is less today than it was 50 or 100 years ago. So why is everyone so afraid, especially parents? Sure, we're afraid that our kids won't have opportunities greater than ours, and we're afraid about being ready to pay for their education, and we're afraid that they will fall in with the wrong crowd. But we're also afraid of them going out to play, of riding a bike, of them being alone, or just being on a playground that doesn't have the proverbial good housekeeping seal of approval. We want our kids to succeed and ultimately to feel at home in the world. But since when did that mean that we could never, ever let them out of our sight? We're going to talk about this today with my guest, Kim Brooks. Kim is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop and a recipient of the Michener Copernicus Fellowship. Her essays and stories have appeared in New York Magazine, Salon, and numerous other publications. It is my pleasure to welcome Kim Brooks here to talk about her book, Small Animals, Parenthood in the Age of Fear. Kim, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. This story all starts with an incident that happened to you personally back in March of 2011. Tell us that.
Sure. Well, I was home from Chicago visiting my parents with my two children in Virginia. It was my last day before flying back, and I needed to buy one item from the store right before going to the airport. So I was with my son, who was about 4.5 at the time, and he asked if he could wait in the car for a couple minutes while I ran in to get this one item. I agreed to that. It was a cool day. It was a safe suburban area. And I let him wait there for a few minutes, came back. He was fine, happily playing on an iPad. Only when I got home to Chicago did I learn that someone, a bystander who I would never meet, had seen me do this, had recorded it on their phone, called the police, and that the police now were interested in pressing charges or charging me for allowing my son to wait in the car.
And talk about your initial reaction to it when you first heard about it. There had to be a sense that this is a joke, that this can't be, that there must be some mistake.
Yeah, I mean, that was definitely part of how I felt. I think there was also just a sense of confusion and fear. One of the things I write about in my book, Small Animals, is, about how much anxiety goes along with just being a parent, just everyday parenting life now, and that we're constantly being presented with so many choices, so many products, so many different competing philosophies. It can be quite overwhelming, and I was not immune from that. So at first I thought, oh my God, wait, did I do something terrible? Why is this happening? And when to have your mothering, your parenting sort of questioned in such a way, or challenged in such a way, I definitely felt a lot of competing emotions: fear, shame, confusion, and then also, as you said, disbelief.
Mm-hmm. Did you begin to think that you did do something wrong? Did you have sort of inner thoughts about what did I do, and was it wrong?
I definitely asked myself that question quite a bit. What the problem was that I couldn't understand what it was. I understood that many people thought I had done something wrong. But, one of the things that was in the back of my head that day was that, I grew up in this area, and I kept thinking, about all the times my parents had let me wait in the car for a couple minutes, or when they ran an errand when I was a kid growing up in the 80s, and also about other things that I had done as a kid, riding my bike to the pool on my own, playing outside on my own, walking to friends' houses, things like that. And things that many people, including myself, maybe didn't really let our kids do these days. And so I thought, why are those things that were so common a generation ago, why have those now become criminal, become taboo? And so, yeah, I mean, that was kind of the beginning of this process of writing about parenthood.
And as you thought about yourself, did you consider yourself to be a fearful parent? Were you one of those parents, or are you one of those parents that is afraid of everything that the kid does?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, definitely I struggled, especially in the early years of being a parent, with anxiety and fear. You know, I would not at all have thought of myself as a fearless parent. Um, and I still don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's natural to feel fear when it comes to our kids because we love them so much, and we want, I think it's natural to want to protect them, to be afraid that they're, in the world. But what I sort of learned was that it's not just that we are feeling afraid all the time about our kids, it's the way in which we're institutionalizing those fears and sort of enforcing those fears. And that sort of was what I've learned to change somewhat.
There's also this kind of cognitive dissonance that goes on between what we rationally know to be the case, what we intellectually know to be the case in terms of what the real level of danger might be or might not be, and how we emotionally feel about it.
Yes, I mean, I think that's very true. That's very well said. It's, when we fear, we often don't fear rationally. And, so one statistic I use in the book is I say, that I learned in my research that the most dangerous thing that I did that day in terms of my son's safety was put him in the car and drive anywhere with him.
Right.
I learned that 487 children on average every year die or are injured in moving vehicle car accidents. So that's just driving places is one of the riskiest things that we do, but we don't feel afraid, most of us, when we get in the car to drive to the store. Whereas things that we are scared of, stranger danger, child abduction, hot car deaths, things like that, plane crashes, we know rationally that these things are very, very, very statistically unlikely.
And you wonder the degree to which there's a whole industry built up almost that gins up that fear in order to sell us solutions or to sell us things that in some ways help ameliorate that fear.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think fear sells. People who feel secure and okay and safe and connected to their community, to a larger community, aren't as likely to buy stuff. I was actually just saying to a friend last night after my book event, this happened at a Target, and I was saying how before this happened, when I was a new mother with my babies, I loved Target so much because I would walk through it and just seeing all the products they have, to help you better carry your kid or feed your kid, or the latest toys or the educational products, and I would just feel like, okay, surely there are things here that are going to help me do a better job or be a better mom or solve this problem or that problem. So I think there is definitely a way in which our consumer culture, the kind of hyper-consumerism of our culture, interacts with fear, and that the two sort of mutually reinforce each other.
The other part of this story, of course, is the woman, the anonymous woman that called the police, that what somebody else thought of this. Talk a little about that.
Yeah, well, we've got into this strange place, I think. Well, the moment we're living in is strange for many reasons,
Right.
But one of the things that's strange is that we've arrived at this moment where when a lot of people see a child who's not being or observed or supervised by an adult, they immediately assume that it's an emergency, right? And that's how this woman treated it. It's an emergency. What do you do in an emergency? You call the police. The problem is that this is a very new kind of mindset. For most of history, children have been able to move through public spaces and move through the world without direct adult supervision and without people assuming that they are somehow immediately imperiled. so I think that when people say, like, what should she have done instead, or what should people do instead, I say, well, like, the first step before you can change how people respond to these situations is challenging that view that a child on his or her own is necessarily in immediate danger. And then the second thing I think a lot about is that, this is someone who saw me come back to the car, who saw me get in, and I didn't even know that she was there until I found out what had happened later. And I think that it's really sad that we live in this moment where it's easier for a lot of people to call the police on someone anonymously, to record something on their phone and post it on social media, than it is to actually just talk to someone, to have a conversation. If you're not sure what you're seeing, is everything okay? Or to even talk to the child, to ask the child if they're okay. But that talking to each other doesn't seem to be something that we're very good at doing anymore.
Right. The other thing that this addresses, and you spend time talking about this in Small Animals, is the judgmental attitudes towards parenting today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I that's something that I do think a lot about. I guess, in so many ways, I think for a lot of people, parenting and parenthood has kind of become our religion right now. It's something that we believe in, and we exalt mothers, we idealize mothers, and then when they don't live up to these impossible expectations of martyrdom and perfection, then we demonize them. And so, if we're looking at motherhood and parenthood in that way, not as a relationship, but as this sort of like idealized, almost religious experience, then it doesn't surprise me that people become very judgmental when they don't think other mothers or other parents are kind of living up to those ideals.
One thing you wonder, and you are from Chicago, so you might have a better sense of this, is the degree to which is this just kind of an urban, educated phenomenon, or is this something that you think could happen anywhere?
Well, I think it's much more of a suburban phenomenon than an urban phenomenon. I mean, all of the cases that I've heard about and that I write about in the book happened in suburban areas. I think that in cities, there's people are more connected. There's more of a sense that public spaces do exist where people can be. I think in the suburbs, there's more fear, there's more boredom, there's less public space, and so I don't think it's an urban issue at all. I think it's an American issue.
Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think that the same thing would happen somewhere in Nebraska or somewhere in Iowa?
I mean, of course it's hard to say, but I do. I think that this happens a lot in suburbs, in planned developments, in places where, and of course it varies. I'm sure that there are small towns, for example, where kids still have more freedom. But remember, this didn't happen in Chicago where I live. This actually happened where I grew up in rural suburban Virginia. So, if it happens in Virginia, or in the case of Deborah Harrell, one mother I interviewed in Augusta, South Carolina, I don't know why it wouldn't happen in Nebraska.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the fear that people have, the fear that parents have today, has any real justification behind it? I mean, in the people that you talk to and you're reporting on this book, were people able to point to situations, point to incidents that happened that drove their fear? Or was this kind of free-floating anxiety that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that, I think that people don't feel safe right now, for good reason. Adults don't feel safe for themselves. We don't feel safe for our children. Part of that, I think, is larger social problems, environmental problems, political situation in this country. there's a feeling of insecurity that we're not connected to each other and we're not protected. The problem is all those things that I mentioned, what do you as an individual person or parent really do about those things? Rising class inequality, the soaring cost of education, the prospect of global warming or environmental disaster. Those things that are sort of in the atmosphere. Sometimes we can feel like there's not much we can do. I think what happens then is this sort of free-floating anxiety. We project it onto specific issues and onto our children. And so, I might say to myself, well, I can't do much about the fact that we might not have an inhabitable planet in 50 years, or that I might not be able to afford a higher education for my kids. But I saw some segment on the news about a kid who was kidnapped, so I can make sure I never let my kid walk down this street, or I can cut up their food into tiny little pieces to make sure they don't choke on something. So I think it's not that I think there's anything unnatural, or I think it's very understandable that parents feel afraid. I often feel afraid. What's problematic to me is what we do with those feelings.
Right. I mean, I guess the comparison is, and I'm older than you are. I grew up in 50s and 60s. And there was a lot of fear then, too. I mean, there was fear of nuclear war, duck and cover drills in school, and air raid drills, and all those things that we were afraid of then, that, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the world could be annihilated. And yet that fear and that anxiety at that point didn't manifest itself in quite the same way that all of our fear and anxiety today is playing out.
That's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think there's two things, and I know what you're talking about too. I mean, I remember there's a sociologist, Joel Best, who I interviewed for the book, and he writes about, for example, how in the 80s, in a national survey, people had to rank things that they worried about for their families. The threat of kidnapping, of child abduction, ranked higher than the threat of nuclear war or the AIDS epidemic, which is kind of fascinating to me. So it's interesting, like, what changed between then and between the period you're talking about. Part of it, I think, might be technology and the 24-hour news cycle, and, the fact that it seems like media is often searching for these very sensational stories of bad things happening to children in sort of shocking and unusual ways. We're sort of saturated with those stories in a way that people probably weren't a few generations ago. I think part of it is also sort of our ambivalence as a culture about mothers working, and the en masse entrance of women into the workforce in the 70s and 80s. We kind of pay lip service to the idea that mothers should be able to work, but I think if you look at our complete lack of supports, of policies and structures to support working mothers, I think it's pretty clear that we're pretty ambivalent about it. So, I think maybe a lot of these feelings come from that sense of sort of shaming women and who's watching the kids, where's mom.
Did you find any differences in the women you talked to and the families you talked to with respect to age or generation? I mean, do millennials approach this differently? Is it better or worse for them? What did you find in that regard?
Well, I do think that, younger people, that millennials, that there might be now a sort of slow brewing backlash to this sort of helicopter parenting, hypervigilant or paranoid parenting trend. And I see that in things like the no schooling movement, or free range parenting, or just simple things like, I've started to hear more things like parents saying things like, well, I'm not sending my kid to camp all summer. Like, I'm going to let them play in the neighborhood with a couple other kids. So I'm hopeful that the pendulum is sort of maybe swinging back in this direction.
I mean, the reason may be that, you can put a GPS chip on the kid now or a bracelet and know where they are at all times.
Right. This is true, and this is something I've done myself. Like, there's this app where, my son, if he's going to go someplace on his own, he has a phone and I can see exactly where he is.
Right.
And I don't know if I really have a problem with that. I mean, sometimes people, I think, want to paint, people like me or like Lenore Skenazy, who, founded the free range kids movement, as these crazy people who don't believe that anything bad can happen and, you shouldn't take precautions. And that's just not really true. I mean, I think bike helmets are great. Of course kids should wear bike helmets. Of course everyone should wear their seatbelt. If there's a way to track your kid with a phone and just to make sure you know where they are, but still giving them freedom to explore, of course we should do those things, because those things don't have a cost. And this is what I talk about a lot in the book, that we can always make things safer for kids or for anyone, but there's a cost. And what I see as the problem is we're often not looking at what that cost is to our children, to parents, to mothers, to society.
Kim Brooks, her book is Small Animals, Parenthood in the Age of Fear. Kim, I thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank
it's
you.
Lovely.